It's interesting on the song that she sang. Basically, we make the choice to allow God to control us or not. And I think the same thing when Hannah talked about. I think one of the problems we have as Americans, it's kind of not only as a country, but as a Christian, we so often think we know how to do everything better than anybody else. And quite often want to go to other parts of the world and tell them how to do stuff. And how to run their service and how to set the service instead of if we just simply listen and we can learn from them. And I think that attitude comes across. So we'll just simply be one to learn and help rather than try to tell people. So just allow the Holy Spirit to feed. We've been going through the David and just different parts about him. And we're on part 6. If you remember the parts we've been looking at, the first time was we looked at it would be what is God looking for, and looking for a man after his own heart to do his will. And we then looked at God's, man looks at the outward part, but God looks at the heart. And then we saw that a friend you can count on in Jonathan. And then we talked about how God removed all his crutches. Every little thing that they looked at to rely on, God took away from him. And then last week, you remember, we looked at to look up and look around. The only person you can look to is God. So today I'd like for us to think about that of pleasing him. And it can be fit for a lot of different parts of David, but I wanted to use that today. You know, it reminded me last night we have a lot of animals in our house. You know, it seems like every animal, when they get lost, they know to come to our house because there's food there. I mean, we've had baby skunks, you know, you name it. We've had them there. You never know what they're bringing home. Well, Dad, the baby and the mama died. There's a bunch of little ones. All right, you know, never know what's going to be there. But it's amazing on every one of them, whether cats, dogs, horses, or whatever it might be, they all have different personalities and desires, and even how you treat them. One wants this kind of food. One won't touch it. One wants to be petted this way. Each one has different things, and you can learn kind of what pleases them. You ever stop and think what pleases God? You ever stop and think about it? Look over in Hebrews, and we'll then be in David, but look over in Hebrews chapter 11, the great chapter on faith and the heroes of the Old Testament. And notice they're talking about it. He's in verse 5. You remember he talks about Enoch. He's already talked about Abel and so on. It says, by faith, this is Hebrews 11:5. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. And by the way, if you look at Enoch, he didn't start walking with God until his son was born. I challenge you to think about that. But he did. And notice what it says. For he obtained the witness that before he was being taken up, he was pleasing to God. Now, it doesn't tell you how he was pleasing to God. But then notice then verse 6, he now takes a break before he goes back to the next verse. Notice in 6, without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he's the rewarder of those who seek him. So if you want to please God, you have to walk out by faith. Is that going to mean then he's going to, in every one of our lives, he's going to bring us to areas that will not make sense? Because if we could do it with our 5 senses, 6 senses, we would not be walking by faith. So every single person is going to come across times in their life when they're not going to understand, and God's now wanting them to walk by faith, whatever it might be. So think about it then. Let's apply that then to David and where we left off. Look over in 1 Samuel. If you remember, David was being chased by Saul, and the Philistine, you remember, basically just kicked him out. He was staying at Gath, and they then kicked him out. And he then goes to the cave. Remember, we saw that last week when he looked up to God and he wrote some of his Psalms that he wrote, 3 of them actually. But notice in verse 5 now, he goes to Moab. So let's just go pick up in verse 3 of chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time David was in the stronghold. If you think about it, if you go to Moab, he is related to him, if you remember, by way of Ruth. So you think about it, he's staying there, and as long as he is in Moab, as well as when he's been Philistines, is Saul going to come down? Saul's not going to come down. Does he want to have a battle with Moab? So as long as he's staying there, so does it make sense to go to a stronghold of Moab and stay down there? Because Saul's going to leave you alone. But notice what does God tell you to do? Verse 5. And the prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah. Okay, if you go to the land of Judah, who's going to come hunting for you?
Saul.
Are you going to walk by faith and do what God tells you to do? Or are you going to say, hey, it makes a whole lot more sense to stay here because Saul hasn't come here and he's not going to? And notice David thought about it and he prayed about it, right? What does he do? As soon as the prophet tells him what God wants him to do, he does it. Now, what you think about it, the walk of faith, notice you think about it, the defense. Humanly speaking, it makes more sense for David to stay where he was at. But God says, no, you need to go back to Judah, which is obviously where he's from. I'm talking about his tribe. He's told to go back. Now, when you get down to, starting in verse 6 and then down to 23, Saul then hears about where he's at, and he then basically in verse 7, he rallies everyone from Benjamin, which is the tribe that Saul's from, and basically says, David's not going to give you these things, but since you're my tribesman, I'll do these things for you. And so he's bringing about tribal rivalry. And then notice in verse 9, Dog the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, answered and said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Nob, Abimelech the son of Abihab. And notice in verse 10 then what the priest did. He inquired of the Lord, gave him the provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath. Now, to understand this, you got to go back one chapter. So let's go back for a moment to chapter 21. When David is fleeing, and what happens, this is what the part I wanted you to notice here, is the danger of deception. When David meets, in verse 1 of 21, when David meets the priest, he's alone, nobody's with him. Notice in verse 2, David says to the priest, the king has commissioned me with the matter, and he has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you, with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Is that true? No. So he lies to the priest, and the priest feeds him and does other things. Notice then, now that Saul knows, he comes down, now he's confronting the priest. Now the priest did what he should have done, but he knows nothing about the fact that David's fleeing. Why did David not tell him that he's fleeing? Was he afraid that the priest would not feed him? You think about it, but if the priest is following God, what would the priest do? So let's think about it then. You pick up the story, and notice then he tells him, the king is addressing him, and Saul addresses him. And then notice in verse 13, Saul said to him, talking about the priest, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, and you have given him bread and the sword, and inquired of the Lord for him, that he should rise up against me by lying in ambush as it is this day? Was David lying in ambush? No. So notice he's lying, and the priest does a great job in verse 11. Notice what he says to the king, and who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard, is under your house? David has access to your house. If he wanted to kill you, he could do it. There's nobody more faithful in all your house than David. He sets the record straight. And notice in verse 15, did I not justly inquire for God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or anything of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. I simply inquired of the Lord and gave him food, and David is a faithful servant. Saul doesn't like it, and if you notice then, he tells his servants to kill him. They won't do it because they're priests. So notice what Dog does in verse 18. And the king said to Dog, you turn around and attack the priest. And Dog the Edomite turned around and attacked the priest, and he killed that day 85. How many priests were killed that day? 85. Should David have been deceptive? No. Why was he deceptive? You think about it. It's a lesson I think we have to all learn, but you need to be honest about it. Now notice then, so when he kills them, if you notice, it's interesting at the end, what happens in verse 21 of chapter 22. You notice only one survives, and he comes to David, and in verse 22 of 22, David said to Abiathar, I knew that on that day when Dog the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Does David accept responsibility? You know, when I lied that day, I put your family in jeopardy, and because of it, they're dead today. And notice then he says, stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. You're safe with me. When you think about it, now if you're the priest, how are you going to be feeling? Only one of 85 survived, or 86. How would you feel towards David about right now? Now again, the record was set straight, and Saul should not have done it, and Saul's not. But when you think about it, when you're walking by faith, you know, we have to turn all the defenses over to the Lord. And so he learned from here, and he sees him in the next chapter, and he says to go out into the open. You go out into Judah, now Saul's going to come after you, and he does. When you stay in Moab, you're safe. How many times does God want to see if I'll walk out in the open with him? Where are you safer, by the way? So think about it, the walk of faith that you have. Would I rather walk with God and trust him in the open, or would I rather hide behind others? Do I walk by in obedience or take matters into my own hands? How many times do we take matters into our own hands? Any of you ever done that? Any of you has to ask God who would clean up a mess? And we say, I'll never do it again, and then what happens? A week later, 2 weeks later. So notice, first of all, when you're pleasing him, it's a walk of faith. And notice it's interesting in chapter 23, he's running now. And remember, he's staying. Notice what it says, the setting. And it's told to David, the Philistines are fighting at Keilah, and they're plundering the threshing hole. And what it is, that's only about 3 miles off from the Philistine border. So they would then raise the crops, and right at harvest time, the Philistines would come across the border and raid it all and steal it and go back, and they'd have nothing. They did all the work all year long, and they'd have nothing. And it's told David. Well, does David from there? You know, it is his tribe, but he's not from there. Is it his battle? And if you already have Saul after you, how many of you now want to have the Philistines mad at you? So think about it. What are you going to do? It's not your battle. That's why I entitled this not only the walk of faith, but what about the work of faith? He's going to be king. But is there other works God wants us to do along the way? Notice then what he does in verse 2. The desire of David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah. Okay, so God told him what to do. Now what does his men tell him? In verse 3, there's doubt. David, notice the men say, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? Hey, we've already got this group against us, and the Philistines are stronger than Saul. Why do we want to go pick a fight with them? Well, are they walking by faith or walking by sight? You ever stop and think, why is God having him do that? Do you think God is trying to tell his men how to walk by faith and not just David? And how David responds, it helps his men to know how to respond. So notice then what he does. He then, in verse 4, David inquired of the Lord once more, and the Lord said, rise, go, for I will give the Philistines into your hands. What should you do? You should go. Notice then the deliverance happens then in verse 5. David and his men went down and fought with the Philistines. He led away their livestock, struck them with a great slaughter. David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Okay, so while he's running, he sees a need, and he asks God, what do you want me to do? And God says, go attack, I'll deliver it. But now also, since he delivers it, does Saul know where he's at? Saul knows, because obviously you're going to hear about that if you're king. So notice then what happens to the desire of Saul then in 6. Came about Nabathar, remember that's the one priest that survived, fled to David Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. When it was told to Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, God has delivered him into my hands. Notice Saul's reading into the circumstances. God's not delivering David into his hands. And notice why. He has shut himself by entering a city with double gates and bars. He can't get out. I go down there and I've got him. He can't go sneaking off in some cave. I've got him. So notice then what he does in verse 9 or 8. Saul summons all the people of war. You ever think about how many people that is? He's summoning everybody, and David has how many men? Okay, remember he has 400. The next chapter he's going to increase to 600. Okay, so you have this many people. David in verse 9 knew that Saul was plotting evil against him. Okay, so he's in the city. He delivered them, right? Did the work of faith. Saul's coming, and he knows Saul's coming. What should I do? Notice what he does then again. In verse 9 through 12, he asks two questions. The two questions he asks, notice he's using the priest for the priest who is of God to ask God two things. Is Saul going to come, and will the people deliver me over to him? Now think about it. What did David just do for those people? David and his men just went and fought the Philistines and saved the crops and saved them and everything else. And now these people, through the prophet is saying, or through the priest is saying, they're going to open the gates and give you over to Saul. Well, that's a kind of nice thank you, isn't it? Does it kind of fit the revenge lesson you had today there? It does, doesn't it? So you love your enemy. But notice these are brothers, are they not? You think about it. So here you have it, here in this text, and notice they're going to give him over, and since they're going to give him over, and by the way, when you think about the priest, how many of you want to answer that question for David? Because what did David do to your family? But are you a servant of God? And is the man not asking, what does God want me to do? And what should I do? And notice he then does ask those two questions, and he's given the answer. So David leaves. David willingly leaves the city. And what does he get for delivering the city? Nothing. But did he do the work that God called him to do? He's walking by faith. When he leaves and goes to Judah, he does the work of God, but he gets no reward for it. In fact, he kind of, if you use the term, gets kicked in the rear, right? You think about it. Am I willing to ask God for directions and then follow them, no matter how difficult it is? And am I willing to simply walk away after I've done my job? It's hard to do. So often when God tells us to do things, we do it, but then we kind of want what? A pat on the back, and you're so good, and we couldn't have done it without you, instead of just walking away. Notice the last part I want you to think about is the wilderness of faith. So notice then, you go back to chapter 23, and notice in verse 13, David and his men, notice they're about 600 now. They leave, they depart from Keilah, and they went wherever they could. When it was told Saul that David escaped from Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. Okay, so he now goes to the wilderness of Judah, which would be along the Dead Sea, just off to the west of the Dead Sea. And he's down here, and notice what he does then. He's staying down here, and he's in the strongholds, the wilderness of Ziph. And notice then Saul is told. And look about it. So he's what Saul's told where he's at. So what does Saul do in the end of verse 14? And Saul sought him every day. How would you like to be hunted by that many people every day? And notice, everybody knows you better turn David in, or else what is Saul going to do to you if he finds out you didn't turn him in? So remember, who told you to go to Judah? God did. And as soon as you got to Judah, now what's Saul doing? He's hunting you every day. But did God promise you that you'd be king? Are you king yet? So who's supposed to protect you? Notice the next part. But God did not deliver him into his hand. How important is it for his 600 men to see that? And how important is it for David to see it? You're following the Lord, and people are hunting you, but if that's what God wants you to do, then that's exactly what you need to do. Notice also then that you're being hunted, but the hand of God's with you. But notice what happens then, that I think it's amazing in verse 16, 17, and 18 what happened. You notice Saul can't find him, but notice who can find him. Verse 16, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David to Horesh to do what? To encourage him in the Lord. It's amazing. By the way, is that not dangerous for Jonathan?
Yes.
His dad's already tried to throw a spear and not only killed David twice, but tried to do it and kill Jonathan as well. But Jonathan goes, and Jonathan finds him, and Jonathan encourages him. How discouraged do you think he is about right now? How many of us are willing to risk our life to go encourage your brother in the Lord, irregardless of what's happening for you and I? So he goes down and he encourages them, and they then go on and notice encouraging words that he gives him in 17. He said, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I'll be next to you." Again, who should be the rightful heir after Saul? And Jonathan's saying, it won't be me, even if I'm the rightful heir. It's going to be you, and I'm going to be there right with you. I'm going to be supporting you. I mean, amazing what he's saying here when he does it. So he goes back home. Notice then what happens in 19. So here he has a helper. Notice in 19 to 26, the Ziphites come to Saul and says, David's hiding in our land. Well, it's really nice of them. By the way, they do it twice. They do it again in 26, same group. So here they go and tell him. So Saul then asks him and says, hey, you just spy on him and find out all his secret hiding places and everywhere he goes, then come back and tell me, and then I'll know exactly where to go and where he's going to go, because I'll see all his hiding places. So they do all of that, and then 24, they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, Hebron, to the south. I have to get somebody there. Maybe I can pronounce all these names. 25. When Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David he came down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. When Saul heard it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul was on one side of the mountain, David and his men on the other side of the mountain. David was hurrying to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize him. Pretty bad situation, wouldn't you say? What happens between 26 and 27? A message comes. Why does the message come? Psalms 54 tells you why. So let's just see what happens, and let's see why it happens. So here they are. He's hurrying to get away. He's now surrounded by a superior, obviously, numbers army. But a messenger in verse 27 came to Saul and said, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land." So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore, notice it says they, not just David. They, the 600 men, they called the place what?
Rock of Escape.
Rock of Escape. Are his men learning how to walk by faith too? But the reason I say that you need to realize between what happens here, the Ziphites, go over to Psalms 54. David wrote a psalm. Let's look at it. In Psalms 54, you'll have three things about it. Psalms 54, look at the title at the top of it. David writes this when the Ziphites came and said to Saul, "Is David not hiding among us?" The reason God comes to rescue you is because David cried out to him in Psalms 54. And right at the last second, news comes, which, by the way, if the Philistines raided, that would have to have taken earlier, and it takes a while for the people to get from the raid down to where Saul was at. So David cries out. Notice he does two things here. First of all, in verse 1 to 3, he says, "To save me by thy name and by thy power." Name standing for who the person is and what they can do. Does David say, hey, I want my 600 men to do it. I think I can do it. He cries out to God to save him. And notice he says to save him, and he also will tell you the reason why in verse 3. Strangers have risen up against me, and violent men have sought my life. Notice the key is in the last part of 3. They have not set God before them. Notice, are these not fellow countrymen? And these fellow countrymen are turning on David, who is supposed to be their king, and giving them over to Saul because they're not seeking God. They're seeking their own height and their own logic and so on. So notice then, he cries out to save him. Notice the second thing he does. In verse 4 and 5, he says to sustain me. He uses 3 words of God. Notice, God's my helper. God's my sustainer. But then notice the hard part. What about 5? He will recompense the evil to my foes. I'm turning it over to who? God, you take care of it. He's getting ready to have 2 more opportunities to kill Saul, and he won't do it. Who's supposed to recompense him? God is. So I'm going to run doing whatever. God, you are in the middle of a wilderness. That's why I call it a wilderness of faith, because how many years of his life does he lose running? But how many valuable lessons is he learning? And how many valuable lessons are his men learning that they need when they later in life? So think about it, and then notice what you have in verse 6. He says, save me, sustain me, and then notice what he says he's going to do. Willingly I will sacrifice to thee. Okay, what kind of sacrifice is that? It's Leviticus 3 and Leviticus 7, that's a peace offering, also called a fellowship offering. And it's in chapter 7 of Leviticus, it's the time of Thanksgiving. Let me think about it. If I'm running and God saves me, are you going to say, God, thank you? Are you going to be upset with God? Why in the world do you have me here? And I think it's important. We're in the middle of the wilderness. He's walking by faith, doing what he's supposed to do. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for taking care of me. And it's also the only sacrifice where you actually, the participant, also got to eat part of it. But it's interesting. He gives thanks to the Lord for delivering him. Notice, does he say, thank you, Lord, for the Philistines delivering me? Because he recognizes God is controlling the Philistines, and they're the ones that delivered. God did. So you think about it. When I'm in the wilderness, will I continue to walk by faith, recognize my place and his place, and turn it over to him? It's easier said than done. But many times, if you haven't been in the wilderness, there'll be times in your life when you will be. Will you walk by faith? So let's think about how we can do this today. When I think about pleasing him, the walk of faith, would I rather walk in the open with God or under the protection of others? Do I walk in obedience no matter what it costs? Think about that work of faith. You remember when he delivered the city. Am I willing to ask God for directions and then follow him with obedience? Those are some odds he was up against, wasn't it? What about the wilderness? Am I willing to go to the wilderness, to walk out in the open with God? Or I'd rather hide where I think it's safe, where I think it's safe, where I think it's safe, where I think it's safe.